I love GD Cologne.
Geometry Dash : you might have heard of this guy. Coin reviews, bad GD copies, making terrible shorts, making terrible ads. Big fan of game design, and I think he made a video of like, what to put in your GD levels or something. I don't know, I haven't watched it. Colin is very well known for his videos about Geometry Dash, but he does more than just make videos. He currently has 24 in-game creator points, which are rewarded by the game's developer, RobTop, when you make a level good enough for him to say, yeah, this level's good, here you go, and give it his official seal of approval. Colin's been making levels for a long time, and I was always interested in this old level of his from 2016, Black and White. The level was made in Update 2.0, and it's very rough around the edges. But I always thought the concept behind this level, mixed with the song it uses, had a lot of potential. So in 2019, I took it upon myself to reimagine the level, see if I could do the idea some more justice. I made a few parts, but ultimately left this on the sidelines since I ran out of ideas, and the current update of the game, 2.1, didn't feel like it really had the features necessary to really bring my vision to life. Fortunately, only 4 years later, the game finally got another update. Continuing this level wasn't my first thought when 2.2 came out, since I'd kind of forgotten about it. But after a while of scrolling through my old stuff, I came across it and realized that I finally have the tools necessary to make exactly what I wanted. And so that's what I did. I've been working on this remake on and off over the past year or so. The hours spent in the editor total to a humble 95, which is pretty quick by my standards, I guess. The level definitely suffers from gets way better as it goes syndrome, which seems to be a running problem of mine. It's like especially bad with this one though. But all in all, I'm really proud of this remake and I'm glad I saw it through. Now, I never really planned on making any videos on this level, so I never documented the process of building it, I never really recorded anything. But after thinking it over, I decided it couldn't hurt to go through the level after the fact and just talk a little bit about the thought process behind each part and how it was made. Maybe do a few effect tutorials and whatnot. So yeah, that's what we're gonna do. The drop in Valiant by Envy hits at 47 seconds. And to be honest, everything up to that point in this level is kind of mid compared to what's during and after the drop. But still, even then, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff to talk about here. I'll try not to drag on for too long. Black and White by wait 1 second, let me fix something here. That's better. Black and White by opens up with this cube section. Strips of, well, Black and White, obscure parts of the Black and White gameplay. This is a pretty cool gimmick, and I probably should have reused it in some way, but I didn't. There's 2 different iterations for this part in my remake. The original first part from 2019 looks a little something like this. The gameplay is as interesting as it looks, and it doesn't have a lot going for it. At the time, I was relying on this cool masking effect to carry the part. These scaling and rotating squares are actually gaps created by, well, let me just recolor these really quick so you can see. Yeah, so those are actually just the negative space created by rotating these surrounding squares. The background is actually in front of the gameplay, but since it's just a low opacity version of the same color, there's no way to tell. Small problem though. In 2.2, you can get this same effect with the new area rotate and scale triggers. It's very simple to do, so this looks a lot less impressive now. And since that was kind of the only thing this part had going for it, I decided to scrap it and start from square one. Square, get it. The new version doesn't have any gimmicks that really make it special. It's more just there to introduce the Black and White theme. These structures have a much more organic shape to them, which mirrors a couple parts later in the level. I added some area scale effects on the spikes and other details, made some stuff bob around, and added these little particles. I added a vignette around everything. All these details really help to bring the part to life. I'll show you what happens when I remove them. The part just feels static and boring. From my experience, it's always the combination of a lot of different details that make your levels feel alive. Anyway, that's about all I have to say with this part. The second part, in black and white by Colin, looks like this. Instead of a stark black and white contrast, it's more just grayscale. It uses different shades of gray. Only a couple, not anything crazy, like 50 or something. Now, there's this pretty old effect in Geometry Dash that I like to call stencil masking. Basically, you take a pattern like this low opacity checkerboard, we'll put it on layer B3, then you copy-paste it, move it down so this copy perfectly fits the negative space of the original pattern, we'll put that on layer B1, and so now you shouldn't be able to see the original pattern anymore. That is, until we place a solid object in between the two patterns. I'll put it on B2. This object covers the pattern on the bottom, but the top part of the pattern still shows on top of it. You can then put another pattern behind everything, say on like B4, and now you have two patterns, where one shows in the background and the other shows on top of your gameplay. So yeah, this is actually really simple to do. And that's exactly what I did in this second part. Obviously, this wouldn't be possible with pure black and white, so the grayscale nature of this part was a good opportunity for me to do this. The only problem I really have with this effect is that the first two patterns have to line up perfectly, or you can see the effect doesn't work at all, and that's pretty limiting. There's actually a similar effect you can do in Update 2.2 that's a lot less limited. When you go to change the color in an object in GD, you'll notice this checkbox called Blending. This basically makes it so instead of the object covering anything below it, it'll instead add its color, making everything brighter. Now, there sadly isn't a way to do the opposite of this. That is, unless you get creative. You see, 2.2 has a lovely trigger called the gradient trigger, and for whatever reason, this thing has multiple blending modes that aren't available with any other object, including invert. If you make the gradient pure white on both sides, don't mess with any of this so that it covers the entire screen by default, give it a new ID so it actually shows up, and set the blending mode to invert, then I'll let you guess, inverts the entire screen. Wow, amazing. So I have this level with a light gray background. If I put an invert gradient on, say, B4, then suddenly we have dark gray. Let's place a happy little cloud on layer B3, and let's give it a dark gray blending so that it adds its color on top of the background. And now if we place another invert gradient on B3, you'll see the background goes back to its original color, but now this cloud is subtracting its color, making the background darker. Let's put another cloud with the same color on layer B1. And it's gone. Completely vanished. The same color got subtracted and then added back again, which cancels itself out. And you can do this with any object you can think of. Let's take a solid square on B2 and move it around. It reveals the light objects in front of it. And now if we pick a default background with some more detail, you can make a custom one, I'll just do this to make it easier, you can see the effect a lot better. Ain't that just the knees bees? I could have reworked this part to use that effect in some way, but I was just too lazy. I just wanted to show you that there is a better way to do this now. I did make some small changes to this part in 2.2, but those just involved adding some details to the structures like this. I didn't bother with anything else. The next part in black and white is this one, a robot part with limited vision. And I was lazy, so I didn't actually do anything with this part. I completely skipped it. But the next part is this ball section. So every couple beats in the song, these platforms switch. Black becomes solid, white lets you pass through, and then vice versa. It's an interesting mechanic that is used honestly pretty well here. In my remade version of this part, I changed it so that the colors swap collisions every time the player clicks. This is cool in concept, though I definitely could have done more with the gimmick. Honestly, with these earlier parts, I could have done a lot more with the gameplay in general, but I kinda didn't. Instead, I focused more on this VHS effect. You know, like those old VHS tapes that you play on TV. You have those, kids still have those these days, right? I added some glow to the sides of the structures that flicker like this. kind of creating that color bleeding look you get with VHS tapes. I also made some wobbly hand-drawn outlines that toggle between 3 different frames. Really, I was just watching way too many Exploshi videos at the time, and I wanted to see if I could get a similar look inside Geometry Dash. The whole idea is a little silly looking back on it. I wanted to create a background that looks like it has parallax. You know, closer stuff moves faster, further stuff moves slower, all that jazz. The effect kind of works. An old creator by the name of Optical, you might have heard of him, made a way better tutorial on this a long time ago. But if you have 2 colors, one brighter and one darker, then you place an object in the middle here with a color kind of in between the 2, you can put a low opacity square, either a bright one on the darker half or a dark one on the brighter half, and if you get it just right, it kind of looks like the color gets inverted where the middle object is. So I basically did that, and then had some rotating cone thingamajigs moving past on the screen. It looks really messy in the middle, but if you add glow to make it seem like the background fades out into darkness, then you can kinda get around that. I've done this effect a couple times before. Here it is in my old level Walkman. I'll remove the gameplay so you can see it better. I also did this in my level Simplest Disco. Again, it's really hard to see, so let me remove the gameplay and maybe up the contrast some. Anyway, coming back to black and white, this effect kind of works, but it does look a bit off. Fortunately, the gradient trigger in 2.2 has a mode called Vertex Mode, where you can draw any quadrilateral shape between 4 different objects. Meaning you can do this. Anyway, this new version looks a lot better. I also added a pixelate filter with hard edges turned off to add to the VHS look. Yes, I did find a use for pixelate with hard edges off, and they said it couldn't be done. Yeah, normally it looks pretty atrocious. Anyway, that's all I made back in 2019. The next part in the original black and white was a simple cube part with not a lot going on. For some reason though, I was dead set on replacing this part with a certain idea of my own. I really wanted to make it so rather than the gameplay looking like, say this, I'll use the first part again as an example, I wanted to add these bars across the screen that would invert everything. The only problem is that there's not really a way to do that in 2.1. The effect I showed you with this part doesn't work with pure black and white for reasons I feel are pretty apparent. I tried a couple things. The first thing I tried was just manually placing objects to make it look like the colors were being inverted. You can imagine this took a while to do. And I didn't really like how this made it so basically none of the details can move. You know I like my movement. There was another thing I tried. I'm gonna give a quick warning ahead of time to anyone with photosensitive epilepsy or anything like that. Either you can skip ahead to this timestamp, or you can look away and I'll tell you when it's safe again. This is what I call a flicker mask. You cover parts of the screen while showing one image, and then you swap to another image and cover all the parts of the screen that weren't covered before. It's kind of like that stencil mask from earlier where the 2 patterns have to line up perfectly. Now, if you swap back and forth between these 2 images, if you do it fast enough, it starts to look like both images are on the screen at the same time. And you can do this in GD. It works well for transitions and other things that don't last very long. I used it for a couple transitions in Jam Factory, and it's a pretty cool effect. It does turn out, though, that when you try to use it for an entire part, especially one with the 2 most contrasting colors possible, and this is where it gets really hard to look at, fair warning, it's pretty finicky. I tried playing into the glitchy aesthetic by adding other glitch effects on top of this, but there really was like no salvaging this, and so I just kinda gave up. By the way, it's safe to look at the screen again, you can do that now, you're good. And dealing with all that caused me to completely lose motivation. Oh hey, you remember that invert feature on the gradient triggers? You also remember how vertex mode lets us make any shape we want, right? Yeah, so 2.2 not only let me do the exact thing I was trying to do, but now it's actually, like, stupidly easy. Anyway, here's the new part. I do a bunch of area effects like I did in the first part, and I did a bit of camera work to give this part some more energy. There's really not a lot more to comment on here. It really is just the first part, but with funny invert effect. And that's the pre-drop. So in conclusion, part of me wishes that I went back and made these parts more interesting, but the louder part of me really didn't feel like doing that. So people seem to like the level anyway, so it's not so bad. I'm about ready to go over to the actually cool parts in this level though, so I hope you're excited. Should be fun. I lied. I'm a filthy little liar. Here, 1 second. There's my liar hat. Now you know I'm lying. I'm not actually done talking about the pre-drop. We still have one last transition that goes into the drop. But it starts before the drop, so I figured that would be better to talk about in this section of the video. In the original black and white, we're greeted with this title text, just in case you forgot the level's name. The text is completely static, it doesn't really do anything. So in my version, I changed that. I then have this camera zoom out and slow down effect, and some camera pinch, and the text zooming out, all building up to the impact of the drop. When the drop hits, you see this really strong impact effect that makes it a lot more exciting. I made the entire screen invert for a few frames when the impact first hits, and I added a wave warp trigger that makes everything ripple like a shockwave was just sent through it. The shader trigger is actually called shockwave, which makes more sense. I really need to fact check the stuff I say before I record it. The most important part of this effect, though, is my frame by frame animation, where I move 1 frame at a time on screen to add the last bit of impact my part needs. I'm genuinely so proud of this transition. Anyway, there's a ton of parts to get through, so I probably won't go into too much detail about each one. This wave part itself is pretty cool, and I'm happy with the energy. The original version of this part in black and white is just a bunch of blocks with some pulses, so I had a fair amount of creative liberty with this part. I wasn't really sure what to do with the foreground, but eventually I landed on this fairly simple design that works pretty well. Everything feels like it lines up nicely, and there's a good amount of space between each thing. It's pretty consistent, space-wise, and that's all that really matters here. I use those good old invert gradients here on the top and bottom. I have it so the gradient moves down on the top, and the top side of it moves a little further so that the gradient gets thinner the more it moves down. And then I just repeat that a bunch of times and have it loop, and do the same thing on the bottom, but the other way around. This can be a little complicated to set up, so I won't go into much detail about it. And the last thing I want to talk about with this part is the moving lines in the background. Now these lines do move vertically since I used this one animated object, but they aren't actually moving from left to right like it looks like they are. I meant right to left. What's happening is that these lines are the same color as the background. I then move some differently colored glow behind them from right to left. Here, if I change the glow's color to red, then you can see exactly what I'm talking about. I really like this effect, and I feel like it adds a lot of energy, which is good since the drop in the song hits pretty hard. Let me actually show you an example of that. I haven't really been doing that in this video. It's fine, you can just watch the showcase after you're done watching this. I don't want to spoil too much. Anyway, that's all I really have to say on the wave part. I have the camera zoom in here with exponential in, and then I cut to this robot part when the camera's moving at its fastest. I then have the camera zoom back out with exponential out. This is called cutting on motion. It's called cutting on action, you nincompoop. A very common technique in editing, and I use it a lot in this level. It makes the transitions feel more smooth. In the original black and white, the robot part has the ceiling slowly close in from the top, which is a pretty interesting gameplay mechanic. I do like it. Instead of having the ceiling slowly move down like this, in my version, I have it bounce down in increments, which makes it feel like this room is kind of crumbling and falling apart. I also have stuff that's attached to the ceiling, bounce down at slightly different rates, so this part feels a lot more dynamic. I went for a mechanical, kind of factory look with this part. Most of these designs are honestly just inspired by stuff on Google Images. Also, fun fact, everything in this part is actually pure black. But there's a reason why it looks like this, and not, well, this. The background uses an effect that's used in a lot of comic books and manga called halftone. There's patterns overlaying each layer of the background, which makes it so less and less of the color can show through. If we color pick this, it's still pure black. This effect looks like it takes hundreds of objects, but it actually only uses, well, around 350, but I feel like that's still a lot less than it looks like. I accomplished this with Update 2.2's Warp tool, and this object that's already made of 2 separate lines. If you line these up perfectly like this, you can make a really fine pattern with not a lot of objects. So the front layer of the background, I have just one of these patterns overlaying it, making it look like the background is made of diagonal lines. And then I copy-paste and flip the pattern, move it down a Z layer, and now both patterns cover up the bottom layer of the background, making it look like it's made up of a bunch of tiny dots, and making it look even lighter. Man, technology these days is truly incredible. This part ends with the ceiling retracting its spikes and flattening the player like a pancake. This was achieved with the pinch shader trigger, and I have a normal shader trigger, making it so that only happens on the player's Z layer. I have this set to an absurdly high value, so the player gets completely flattened before popping back as a ball, as indicated by this Geometry Dash exclusive ball portal. Anyway, people seem to like this ball part, though I personally feel like it's kind of one of the weaker parts. It's at least pretty accurate to the original part it's based off of, though. The foreground is made by taking the circle corner outline thingies and warping them up like this. Then you copy-paste it, rotate it a bit, and fill in the gaps with warped circles. Or, I guess those are ovals. So not a lot of objects, though I do get the feeling scaling them up like this is causing some lag. I popped some glow on these for a little bit of shine. I have them move with area rotate, and that's pretty much it for this part. The background is made up of a bunch of these animated water objects, and then I have shockwave, shockline, and pinch shaders, adding a bit more shape to it. So now we're on to this little transition here. Honestly, there's so much to talk about that I don't really have time for. Basically, this transition is just a ton of different little effects layered on top of each other. It's really interesting how things kinda just manage to come together if you keep adding and changing stuff. It's really kinda fascinating. I made a custom ball that stops in the middle of the screen. I tried to stop the actual player, but it was pretty buggy. If you're wondering what this fancy, elite, elegant font is, it's Times New Roman, but squashed down. I was also sure to add this super generic rotating square effect that every modern creator has used at least once, because I know how much my good friend Subpixel loves that effect, and I just wanted to do it for him. The next 2 parts in black and white are these cube and UFO parts. They have pretty similar decoration and structure, so I just made one UFO part to replace both of these. It's not like it lasts that long. In GD Colon's thumbnail for this level, he showed this invert effect across half the screen, which is kind of clickbait considering that it was impossible to do that back then. But you can do exactly that now pretty easily. Colin himself actually specifically asked me to do this, so I guess I couldn't pass up on that. I made this invert gradient spin around the screen on each beat, and I even added a little smear to it using another gradient trigger. Probably a lot of work for something hardly anyone will notice, but I feel like it adds some nice polish. Another thing Colin actually helped me with this part was some issues I was having with making it go backwards like this. I wanted the part to represent how the original level had a mirror portal right here. I tried doing exactly that, tried using a mirror portal, but wouldn't you know it, mirror portals completely break gradients. Thank you, RobTop, that's awesome. I also tried the reverse trigger and arrow triggers, but I hate working with those. They break everything and are dumb and bad. So I was kind of out of ideas, to be honest. But then Colin had the idea to just use a camera rotate trigger to flip the camera upside down, and then just flip the gameplay vertically. And that works. Thank you, Colin, very cool. This part has a lot going on, so there's a couple more things I want to talk about before I move on to the next one. First is the 3D on these blocks. This might look like it took a long time to set up, but I found a pretty good way to do it, and I wanted to share that with you guys. I'll make a new level really quick as an example. Here is my gameplay. I hope you like it. Now for this example, I am using a static camera trigger, making the camera follow this camera guide that is in turn following the player. So now I copy-paste all this stuff a few times, and give each layer a different group. Bump down the Z layer of all of these, and probably make them a darker color, or at least a different color. At the start of this part, I simply scale each layer of parallax with the camera guide as the center. I'll do 3 layers, I did 5 in black and white. We'll set the scales to 0.9, 0.8, and 0.7 on both the X and the Y, and we'll make the move time instant on all of these. I then place some move triggers and set each of them to follow the camera's X and Y. For each layer of parallax, I set the X and Y mod to 1 minus what the layer is scaled by with these scale triggers. 0.9 scale becomes 0.1 movement, 0.8 becomes 0.2, and 0.7 becomes 0.3. And that's it! This works completely flawlessly now, it was that easy. You can even link all these layers together and then just copy-paste the block. And now if we play what we made, it just works. It's beautiful. And so that's what I did with this part, and it saved me a lot of time. And the wave part after this is pretty much more of the same. I did the same 3D effect. I have the same camera movement, same spinning gradient. A couple things that set this part apart though is, first of all, it moves the normal direction instead of mirrored. Holy crap, that's insane. Also, the wave here teleports when the player moves off screen. I was pretty easily able to do this with the following setup. I have a wave portal set to free mode, and I do the same static camera thing where the camera is following this camera guide that's following the player horizontally, but not vertically. That makes it so the wave here can move across the entire screen, and more. I then have a collision block on both the top and bottom outside of where the player can see. I have these follow the player horizontally. I have a collision trigger that makes it so when the player collides with the collision block on top, the player gets teleported, with ignore X on, to this object. Also be sure to turn on no effects on the teleport trigger, it makes it look nicer. I then do basically the same thing with a collision block on the bottom, teleporting the player on top. Just make sure that the player doesn't touch either collision block when they teleport. Otherwise, yeah. So that's the main gimmick in this part. The original part in black and white was just kind of an uneventful mini-wave with nothing going on. I didn't need to do this teleporting gimmick, but I felt like it added some spice. And with that, we're on to the final transition before the Duel part. In the original black and white, this mini-wave was followed up by a quick ball part that seemed to feel the need to copy Deadlocked. And then after that, we have a Duel section. There's 2 separate players to keep track of, everything starts moving faster, and overall this part being so late in the level makes it pretty intense. I'm pretty excited to show you what I did with this part, but for now, let's focus on the transition into it, because I think that's pretty cool too. I love dangling carrots on a stick in front of you guys, it's very fun. I completely scrapped the deadlock ball, and I just have this mini-wave lead straight into a little cutscene. Now there is so much going on here. Just like the earlier transition, I kind of have a rule where I like to spend as much time on my transitions as I'd spend on an actual part, which means cramming a lot of details into a very short space of time. I won't talk about everything going on here because, just trust me, that would get really boring. I'll talk about a couple things though. First are a couple lovely principles of animation called anticipation and squash and stretch. I have the player squish down, preparing to jump, and then I have them launch themselves at this duel portal. You can really feel the motion of it because of how the player gets stretched out when they move. And then I use the same principle of cutting on motion here, cutting right when both the player and this portal are moving at their fastest. There's a ton more things to talk about here, but I think that'll do for this video. If you want, feel free to go in the editor and try to dissect how I made this level. My triggers are very messy, I apologize, but as we're about to dive into the most intense part of this level, I think that'll do for this section of the video. I hope you've got your critical thinking with you, because from here on out, things might just get a little less black and white. I'm sorry. Now, I said things would get less black and white, and I wasn't lying. This part is quite gray, I do say, which is also the case in the original level. The first thing I want to talk about here is the background. This cool wavy effect was actually really simple to make. I just used this animated object to make some moving lines, then by using shaders on just the background layers, I just use a simple shockwave trigger for this whole effect, that's pretty much it. I used some more shockwave triggers set to animate to make this ripple effect get thicker and finer to the music, and I also used some glitch shaders to add a little more flavor. Speaking of stuff going to the music, I move the camera to the music and have these motion lines fade in, all creating an added sense of speed. I would have loved to do more shaders over everything to add even more to this, like motion blur maybe, and stuff like that, but unfortunately you can only do all your shaders on the same layer, and I already have this background effect going on, so I can't do that. I have some flickering glow on the right side of each spike and platform that creates some type of motion blur. I scale these pieces of glow horizontally to the music. Also, do you remember this part back here? Specifically the background. Well, I did something similar for the ground here, though it's a little hard to see. This ground speeds up and moves by faster to the music as well. I'll show you really quick how all this looks together. So yeah, it all really comes together, I do say. Also proud of this block design idea with the sort of static fuzz look to it. Originally I used smaller pixel objects for a more fine look, but then I had this crazy thought where I was like, you know, what if this didn't use over 11,000 objects? I tried out these squares that are twice as big in each direction, 1/4 the objects, and it honestly looks just as good. Oh man, I actually forgot to put this in the script, but I wanted to show you an old version of this Duel part. Originally, I wanted to have these, like, hand-drawn houses moving really fast with the music, with another VHS effect kind of calling back to this part back here. And I ended up landing on this, but it just didn't feel like it fit in with the rest of the level. It also used a lot of objects, and overall I think the final version of this Duel does work quite a bit better in the context of the level. And that leads us up to what is definitely the hardest part of this level. There's actually no comparable part in the original black and white. I added this as my own extension, so I had the freedom to do basically whatever I wanted. Originally, I wanted to do more organic shapes, until realizing that I suck at art. This background effect is made by taking this animated object, copy and pasting it a bunch of times into a big old cube, and then copy pasting this whole thing 3 times and flipping it until you get this. I then just popped a lazy-ass shockwave trigger over this, and yeah, that's basically it. I want to show you how I got it to follow the camera perfectly though, cause it's actually a really neat trick that me and Yorid found. So obviously, in Geometry Dash, you can use a move trigger to make stuff follow the camera. But the problem is that you can't exactly move it to the center of the camera. This little smiley face we have here just follows the camera at wherever it's already at, which makes things pretty hard if the camera isn't in a set position. Like, let's check on free mode on this ship portal, and now, what do I do when the camera could just be literally anywhere by the time I'm done with the ship part? What am I supposed to do with that? Well, fortunately, there's an easy solution to this. You just use advanced follow with the center camera option. I'm just kidding. That locks our object to the bottom left of the camera, silly. Seriously, RobTop, please fix this. Luckily, me and Yorid finally found a workaround to this. You can apparently have area move triggers use the center of the camera as their reference point, and unlike advanced follow, this actually works. You can also use this trick to lock stuff to the top or bottom or left or right or whatever you want. That's actually how Yorid originally discovered this when making the end screen for Skeletal Shenanigans. If you set area move triggers to relative, then stuff will move away from your center point, unless you set the move distance to a negative number, in which case everything will move towards your center point. If you set the length to a ridiculously high number, and then the move distance to a ridiculously negative number, then check the second of these 8 boxes, you can have something always lock to the center of the screen, and yeah, it works. It's great, it's awesome. In black and white, I have this smiley face locked to the center of the screen using this method. Then I use advanced follow to have the background follow the smiley face. I have been informed by Aimbotter that this doesn't work unless you put a tiny bit of easing on the advanced follow trigger for whatever reason, so I guess do that. You'll want to make sure the group that's advanced following your area move object has a parent object. You do this by selecting one object and hitting this P button instead of add group. Anyway, I thought that was pretty useful. I don't know, maybe it was a little boring. I hope I didn't drag on too long. On to gameplay! Yay, gameplay! I have all these triangles move using area rotate and area move triggers. Aha, another boring tutorial, take that. In order to get something to move or rotate in a constant direction, I do the following. I first place one area move trigger with its length set to maybe like 150, it's a pretty good number. I'll set it to X and Y mode, and I'll set these to 100 and 20. Now I'll place a few objects, set one of them to area parent, link this whole thing, and give it a group. I'll then give this area move trigger a new effect ID, set it so it affects the group I just gave that group of objects, and I'll use the player as the effect center, and pick the bottom left option here. Now you'll see that the object moves until it reaches the player and then stops. So what we do next is we copy paste this area trigger, give it a new effect ID, set mod front and mod back to -1, and invert our move values like this. Now the object will keep moving in the same... Shut up! Now the object will keep moving in the same direction, even after it passes the player. And you can do basically the same thing with area rotate or scale, or tint or alpha maybe, I don't know. Now if we have a few different variations of this effect, we can pretty easily make each platform fly around on screen, while still being in the exact position it needs to be when the player needs to land on it. And the last thing I'd like to talk about with this part is the false allegations that it apparently uses the color red. I've heard a lot of people complain that this part uses red when the entire gimmick of this level is like it being black and white, but it's a good education opportunity here. This is actually a perfect example of what we call mass hysteria. As you can see, this part obviously uses no color at all, everything is completely grayscale, and you can't prove anything. Moving on! Now unlike with the robot part, the next part in this level is actually based off of one small ship section at the very end of Black and White. The original level doesn't end on the Duel, but for whatever reason, Colin decided to stick this little bit after it. The main reason I made the whole robot part is that I wanted to extend the final drop to actually play through the entire drop of the song. In the original level, it just kind of cuts off, like this. I think Colin might have just gotten bored and given up. So that's why I put my ship section after this robot extension. In the original level, the gameplay moves up and down some like this. In my version, I decided to make a little white guy slam himself onto the floor and ceiling, sending these waves of spikes at the player. At the very end, he commits mitosis, and the player has to stay in the middle to avoid spikes on both sides. The squash and stretch and all the animations on this guy took a while to do. I use multiple center points for the scaling. Like when he starts stretching vertically, I have that scale from his center, and when he slams into the ceiling, I have him scale down from an origin point at his top so that he stays touching the ceiling. There's a lot going on, and it gets pretty complicated. This wave of spikes is pretty cool. I, of course, used area move to do this. Just kidding, I'm mentally ill, so I set up the triggers manually for every single pillar. The background in this part is pretty simple. I just made a bunch of rectangles, added mini spikes to the side of each one, and then I set them to no touch, so the player doesn't die to them. And I changed the HSV of each slice for some nice variation. I then have each layer move at a different speed, and I have them speed up and slow down to the music using sign in out on a move trigger. I reset the position of these in a really lazy way called randomly placing move triggers that move them instantly in the opposite direction until it just happens to work. Trial and error is my best friend, I love it. And the last thing I wanted to talk about with this part is the parallax at the very end. I lined this up in a similar way to my parallax in the UFO part. Because I'm not using static camera right now, I was back in the UFO part. To get the exact center of the screen, I just used the center object of this background back in the robot that was already following the camera. I mean, it's already set up, so might as well use it again. And so, that brings us to the final part in this level. The original Black and White obviously ended here, but I wanted that tasty XL label on my level so everyone knows I'm a tryhard. In order to get that, I just have to make my level over 2 minutes, and this part would extend it to that length. I had some cool ideas for the extension anyway. I genuinely really wanted to make the ideas I had, so I didn't mind making it. Now a lot of the stuff in this part looks the way it does because of a little effect I like to call posterization, also known as color banding. If I take this image in Photoshop and use the eyedropper tool, you'll see that there's quite a few different colors at play here. If I apply this effect called posterization though, it limits the colors to a total of whatever number you put in here. You can achieve this look in a few different ways in Geometry Dash, but the way I like to do it is through an edit color trigger. I made a little video on my second channel trying out this effect on Theory of Everything too, and you can see it creates a pretty cool effect. All we have to do is set the contrast values on this edit color trigger to an absurdly high number. I found I liked 19 the best in black and white. You'll also want to turn down all the brightness values quite a lot. You kinda just have to eyeball it. But I ended up settling on -8 with this part. And so if we pick a cube with a gradient on it like this, you can see that the color in this part is greatly limited. That's what allows me to do this really cool effect on the credits text at the end. Because of how few colors the game has to work with, anything with this specific color of blending only shows up if it's overlapping another object with some amount of brightness. And that makes for this really cool decaying look, where I overlap the same text twice, and move each one around slightly so that they don't overlap perfectly. And the coolest part is that the text still does show up on top of these tiny lines in the background, so when I have it fly off the screen like this, you can still kind of see its after image. I genuinely really love this effect. I'd love to see more people give posterization a try in their levels, and I'll probably use it in some of my future levels, to be honest. It's really cool. Now the other notable thing in this part is the fact that the player moves from the foreground into the background for the second half. The layering for this was a little complicated to set up, and making the gameplay in the background here just took a lot of trial and error. I love this effect though, it's so fun. I love this gimmick. Fun fact, the gameplay in the foreground here is actually still playable and goes to the music. I didn't bother doing that with any of the gameplay in the background that the player isn't actually playing. That's way too much trouble for no good reason. Now I won't go into detail on how I set this up because it's pretty complicated, but I will mention that having several layers of decoration all follow the camera at different speeds can create a really nice sense of depth, and I'm pretty happy with that in this part. Also, if you're wondering what the gameplay in the far background is, it's a one-for-one recreation of Poltergeist. You know, the third main level in Geometry Dash. I saw a couple people notice that, which is cool. The final thing I want to talk about with this part is how it slows down here at the end. You can use time warp triggers in Geometry Dash to slow down the gameplay, and I do that in this ship part back here as well. It looks kind of choppy though, since it slows down instantly with no easing. You might be wondering how I got this more smooth look, and I'd love to show you. I have issues. Finally, we end on this little end screen I made. It's not super high effort, but it gets the job done. I have these effects going to the music by using a spawn loop and sequence trigger. Every 0.4688 seconds, this spawn trigger spawns itself. I got this really specific number from dividing 60 by the 128 BPM this level song uses. It's not perfect, so I guess eventually this would go out of sync, but that would take an extremely long time before it's noticeable, probably longer than the rest of the song even is. I have this spawn trigger, spawn a sequence trigger, that you want to set to loop mode, that loops through this sequence down here. That's how I got this looping animation. I could talk more about the stuff going on with this end screen, but I don't feel like it. I think this video is kinda due to end soon. I've been going on for a while now. To complete the level, you double click. I was gonna make the level complete by just clicking alone, but I didn't want people to skip the end screen on accident without actually wanting to do that. I don't know, I'm probably overthinking it. Finally, I got bored, so I made this happen when you beat the level.
Congrats! You just beat black and white fight! Good job!
Like and subscribe. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. Sorry it took a while to get out. I wanted to get it out sooner, but I've been dealing with a lot of stuff in my personal life, so got it out when I was able to. There's some stuff in this level I didn't talk about. I mean, there's a lot going on, and there were a couple things I just cut out from the video because my explanation didn't make any sense, or I even just, forgot how I made something, or was completely wrong. Anyway, thank you to RobTop for the weekly demon. That's crazy. I didn't expect that. Sorry the gameplay in this level is kind of an afterthought. I didn't really try with it. I didn't expect this to get weekly demon, so sorry if your experience wasn't the best. But if you enjoyed it, I'm glad. In conclusion, I probably could have reworked the earlier parts in this level to have the same quality as the later ones. I could have made the pre-drop harder too, so the difficulty would have been more balanced overall. Or I could have made the later parts easier, I guess. I didn't want to go back and rework stuff though, and the rest of the level just kind of turned out how it did. I wasn't really thinking that hard about it. At the end of the day, this was a small project made for fun, and if you happen to enjoy it, then that's awesome. I hope you enjoyed this video and seeing some of the behind the scenes on how the level was made, and I hope you have an awesome day. Bye!